We're here at the CROI in Boston, and ironically, there is nothing. I don't think there's anything on the Zika virus at the conference, but that's probably not inappropriate. But it is important for us to understand the relative risks, and the Zika virus is of great concern to a lot of people, especially childbearing women. So I guess this is our opportunity to speak with Larry Madoff from the State Health Department of Massachusetts, who happens to live in the city here, and made it real handy for you to, and also talked about the Ebola virus as well. We did a panel with Jean-Francois as well. So if you could just kind of address some of the work that you're doing and the thoughts you have on that.
Sure. Disease. Why don't I back up and talk about Zika virus for a minute, just to give a background. This was a virus that was discovered in 1947, actually, in the Zika forest region of Uganda in East Africa, and was initially thought to be fairly rare. It's an arbovirus, meaning it's a virus that's transmitted through the bite of mosquitoes primarily. And so it's similar to some of its cousins, yellow fever virus, the dengue virus, Japanese encephalitis. These are all viruses that are in the same group of flaviviruses that are transmitted also by the bite of mosquitoes, in these cases by the bite of Aedes, a genus of species known as Aedes mosquitoes, Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus are the mosquitoes that were primarily involved in the transmission of these viruses. There was not a lot of work done on Zika. It was thought to be a relatively mild and self-limited disease, and it traveled, as viruses do, through infecting people primarily, perhaps through infected mosquitoes that traveled. And so it traveled across Asia, through South Asia, through Southeast Asia, into the Pacific Islands, and a notable outbreak occurred in the island of Yap in the South Pacific that was detailed in 2007, where much of the population of that island, some 7,000 people, were infected by this Zika virus.
And that was through the mosquitoes?
All through mosquito bites, transmitted from...
Not from one person to another, but from the mosquito to the...
We think that the major route of transmission of Zika virus, like its cousins, dengue and JE and yellow fever, are through the bite of infected mosquitoes.
So they bite you, and then you're infected, and then it also bites me?
They take a blood meal from a person who's infected, who has viremia. That blood contains the virus. The mosquito actually becomes infected, and that's important. Many viruses are in the bloodstream, but they aren't transmitted from person to person via mosquito bites. Remember, at one point there was a fear of HIV being transmitted by mosquito bites, but that really hasn't ever been borne out. And these arboviruses actually have a life cycle in the mosquito. They propagate, they proliferate in the mosquito, and so they can.
So the mosquito is not the blood from your body to my body, but it's the blood going into your infected blood going into the mosquito. The mosquito then is infected, and not blood, but
the
its
virus
bite
proliferates in the mosquito, and its saliva actually spreads the virus to the recipient.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Right, and so that's important. That's how arboviruses operate, and so I'm mentioning that it traveled through the Pacific, and then it was discovered in Easter Island off the coast of Chile just a couple of years ago. And then we presume that it made its way to Brazil, either from Easter Island or from some other route during the World Cup events that happened in Brazil. And so these diseases are inextricably tied, to human migration, to human travel, and we know that there's no place in the world that is really more than a plane ride away.
Right. So the mosquito travels on the plane. Is that?
Or probably more frequently, what happens? There are cases like that where the mosquito probably travels, and you
That's
have
why they spray the plane before you leave.
Yeah. They say we'll walk down the aisles of the plane and spray mosquito spray during the flight. But probably more frequently what happens is a person or an animal potentially that's infected can get off the plane and in an area where there are the right mosquito species can spread that virus. So both, we see even malaria, for example. We'll see airport malaria, where a mosquito presumably gets off the plane, manages to travel through the plane, bites someone near the airport who gets malaria. But more frequently, we think it's probably infected people that are traveling while they're either prior to becoming symptomatic or after becoming symptomatic, and then a mosquito in the new area where the person has traveled to bites that person and transmits it and sets up a little local chain of transmission. And that's probably what happened in Brazil back in 2014, and then it's become a very prevalent infection now in the Americas because there's never been prior immunity to this disease, to Zika virus. There's a huge number of susceptible hosts. There's a competent vector species present in these areas, and so you see widespread transmission. And then what happened is that public health authorities noted an upsurge in cases of microcephaly. And I would emphasize that while there's a lot of sort of suggestive evidence at this point that microcephaly is linked to Zika virus infection, I would say that there still is not definitive proof of that. It's going to require some additional careful study. But I think there's increasing evidence that Zika may be involved in the upsurge of cases of microcephaly that have been seen. So the US CDC has taken the step of cautioning pregnant women against travel into Zika areas, the areas where Zika virus is being transmitted.
Is this virus any more, debilitating than it was initially? Is it evolving, or is it pretty much the same?
I would say that's an unanswered question, whether there's evolution of the virus. That's certainly something that we see with all viruses, and these RNA viruses, like Ebola, like HIV, are very mutable and prone to changing, prone to evolving. I would say that there is not yet evidence that evolution of the virus is involved in this spread. This could just be spread of the virus and into a new, large, susceptible population. It may be that something like microcephaly or or Guillain-Barré syndrome, another disease that has been potentially linked to Zika virus transmission. We may just be seeing this because of the large populations that are now being affected with the virus. And under the microscope of public health, we're able to pick up what may have been rare, unusual events in the past and seeing them in a large population like this.
So how does this pathogenesis happen? Do you feel that it's able to be recognized quickly enough to
So Zika virus infection looks a lot clinically like dengue virus infection or chikungunya infection, which are two other arboviruses, mosquito-borne illnesses that are very prevalent already in the Americas. There are many thousands of cases of those viruses. There were probably over 1 million cases of chikungunya that were recorded in the Americas. And the syndrome of Zika infection is similar or perhaps even more mild than those two viral infections. A fever, a rash, in the case of Zika virus, often some conjunctivitis, red eye or pink eye is seen, sometimes some muscle or joint pains. So clinically it's very difficult to know whether someone has dengue or chikungunya or Zika
without being tested.
Without being tested in the laboratory, and what that has led to is a dependence on lab testing and often confusion about what someone is sick with.
So when is the best time for a person to, if they perceive a risk, if there is some evidence in their community? Obviously, if there is no evidence in a state, it's very unlikely that this is what's happening.
Right, and I would emphasize that the virus is very unlikely to spread in most of the U.S. There are some limited areas where dengue and chikungunya have spread in the past because there is an abundance of the Aedes mosquito vector, for example, in South Florida, along the Texas-Mexico border, in Puerto Rico and Hawaii. There are some areas where transmission of dengue and chikungunya have occurred. But for most of the U.S., even though those viruses have been very prevalent, and certainly we see them in returning travelers, they don't transmit. So there's really no risk to people in most of the U.S. who have not traveled into these endemic areas. And what we worry about instead is just that disease in travelers who travel to areas where the disease is endemic. So a U.S. traveler who goes to the Caribbean, who goes to Latin America, and is bitten by a mosquito could become symptomatic. As I said, for the overwhelming majority of people, that's really not a consequential thing. It's a mild, self-limited illness, and there's really no need to be tested. It'll go away. The exception to that is in pregnant women, where there is this potential risk of fetal malformation.
And how does that play out? It's like infected, and then they have to, within that infection period?
If it's like other viruses that have the potential to cause fetal malformation, there are probably windows during the pregnancy when that's likely to happen. And during those periods of time, if the infection occurs, there might be a risk to the fetus. And so for those women, that's who we are recommending testing for women who either become symptomatic during pregnancy or have traveled in an area, because we also know that most people who get infected by the Zika virus have no symptoms. Probably 80% of people who are infected by the virus show no symptoms at all. And so for women who've traveled in an endemic area, we recommend testing. If the testing is done very soon after they return, we can actually look for the presence of the virus. If the testing is done later, after a week or so after they've returned, then we need to look for evidence of infection from their antibody response. And so we look for an antibody response to viral infection. And in those women who may have become infected, we recommend very careful monitoring of the fetus during pregnancy to look for bad outcomes. Again, we don't know how frequently that will occur, even in pregnant women who are infected, or, as I said, even definitively that it occurs at all. But I think the evidence is pointing us in that direction.
So how do you handle travel medicine? Because this is always helpful to prepare and to prevent and to follow up post-travel. Is that through just doctors' offices and so forth?
Right. Well, the Public Health Department and the CDC issue general guidance to people. For example, anybody who's going to an area where there are arboviruses should be very careful about exposure to mosquitoes. And there's a lot that we can do to limit our risk of mosquito bites that range from staying in a screened area, sleeping under mosquito netting, staying in air-conditioned buildings, wearing long sleeves, using insect repellents like DEET. Those drastically reduce the risk of mosquito bites and therefore reduce the risk of arboviral infections, also the risk of malaria and other kinds of mosquito-borne illnesses. And so that's the kind of recommendations that we give people. In travel medicine as a whole, somewhat complex field that if people are traveling, we would definitely recommend that they talk to their doctor, their healthcare provider, and get travel advice either from their own doc, from publicly available resources, or by visiting a travel medicine specialist who can certainly give them more detailed information about the risks in a particular area and the measures that they can take to limit those risks.
And there's, of course, always inoculations that one has to take for certain areas of travel, for other diseases.
Right. Those are relatively rare that vaccines are required. For example, there's a vaccine against yellow fever, one of the arboviruses, cousins of Zika, which is present only in certain parts of Africa and Latin America. And so travelers to those areas can get vaccinated against yellow fever. There are some other travel recommended vaccines, but those are relatively unusual. But there are other measures that can be taken, just for example, what to eat and drink in developing countries is something
Another
that
part of travel medicine.
Right, is another
yeah,
part
yeah.
of travel medicine.
And what's safer and safest. I think it's always important to do that, and a lot of doctors, there are a number of doctors that specialize in it. I just didn't know
Right.
how that's handled in Massachusetts.
Right, right. We do have a number of very good travel medicine specialists and travel medicine clinics in the state that we recommend people go to.
Right. Oh, anything else before we wrap up? Because I know that this is people are fearful of the unknown, as we said earlier, but is there anything that you'd like to pass on to the audience?
I just want to say that we know that new infectious diseases are going to be with us, are going to emerge, which means we're going to discover new diseases, and old diseases are going to move into new areas and new populations, and this is just something that we need to be vigilant about, and that it's the role of public health to be aware of these things, to detect them early, to be able to let the public know about the risks and what measures we can take to minimize those risks.
Thank you very much, Larry.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Fred.
it.
Nice to
Appreciate your help.
My pleasure.